Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
Welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the economic crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicaud from the United Nations University. And with us here today, we have Peter Schiff, who is currently the president of Eurocapital Incorporated. Mr. Schiff is also known for being one of the first people to warn us about the current crisis, and he even published a book entitled Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. I think that the book was published in 2007.
Correct.
So Mr. Schiff, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And so Mr. Schiff is here with us today to speak on what caused him to foresee the crisis, and he will also share with us his views on the way forward. So as a way to begin our conversation, Mr. Schiff, so when did you begin to really get a sense of something being amiss in the economy?
Well, sure. Well, first, what's happening right now, this is not the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
These are the consequences of the crisis.
Yes.
The crisis was happening for years as the U.S. Federal Reserve flooded the economy with cheap money.
Mm-hmm.
We kept interest rates much too low, and as a result, we interfered with a lot of normal free market forces that would have reined in excessive risk-taking, which would have held asset prices in check. Instead, we blew up a gigantic bubble that has now burst. But the problem is not that the bubble burst, but that we inflated it in the first place.
So why did we do that?
Well, we did it for political reasons. I mean, we did it because, first of all, in 2001, 2002, we should have had a more severe recession as a consequence of the bursting of the stock market bubble. But the politicians did not want that recession to take place. They thought that the voters would not be happy. So both Bush and Greenspan tried to stimulate the economy with low interest rates and deficit spending. And the result is the crisis that we're in today, because it was those policies that led to the excessive risk-taking and inflated asset prices that led to the losses in the financial sector and all the bankruptcies and now the misguided government policies to try to prop companies up, to bail companies out, to reflate a busted bubble. And of course, you had all the moral hazards that were created by government entities and government-sponsored entities like Freddie and Fannie, which interfered with market dynamics, which caused or resulted in entities growing to enormous size and taking tremendous risk, because the lenders no longer really cared about the creditworthiness of the borrower, because the borrower was working on a government guarantee or on this assumption that the borrower was too big to fail.
So as a way to avoid recession in the early 2000s, we even created a greater crisis.
Sure. Well, the way to avoid a recession is not to have a phony expansion.
Yes.
You see, when you have an expansion that results from artificially low interest rates, right, those booms sow the seeds of their own bust. So actually the recession is the good part. The recession is the cure. The problem is the boom. The mistakes are made in the boom. They're corrected in the bust. But the correction of those mistakes is a painful process. And rather than allowing market forces to restore balance to the economy, politicians endeavor to interfere with that dynamic. They try to recreate the conditions of the boom because that felt better. But in doing that, they sow the seeds of a far greater crisis down the road. And unfortunately, that is precisely what we're doing now.
So for how long have we been in a phony economy, as you call it? For how long has it been?
I think it's been a long time in the making. I think you can really
10 years,
trace
20 years?
Well, longer. I think if you go back to 1971, when we really abandoned the gold standard, and the world first adopted the US dollar as the reserve currency, despite the fact that it was no longer backed by gold. Because prior to the dollar being the reserve currency, gold was the reserve. Countries held gold as their reserves. We convinced the world to hold dollars on the basis that the dollar was backed by gold. But once we removed that gold backing and the world still maintained the dollar as a reserve currency, that set into motion the dynamics that are in play, where America began to be able to consume beyond its means because we could run perpetual trade deficits because we could pay for our imports by printing money. And that process began a long time ago, and it finally, I think, reached its zenith a few years ago, where years and years of reckless borrowing and spending had produced a completely unsustainable bubble economy in the United States, where we had developed a service sector, a financial economy that was predicated on ever-increasing asset prices and the ability to go into debt in perpetuity.
And yet we're going further in this direction with the current policies.
Well, that's unfortunately the reality. I mean, we have this gigantic fire, and the government is trying to put it out with gasoline. And it's not going to work. We have to come to terms with the severe structural problems with our economy and allow market forces to correct those imbalances.
So what would be the correct analysis of these structural pathologies in the current economy? So in your view, what are the main problems, and how do we solve them?
Well, the main problems, again, is excess consumption and not enough production, excess borrowing and not enough savings. And we need to allow these forces to change. We need interest rates to rise, right? Not low. We need high interest rates. Higher interest rates will discourage borrowing and will encourage savings. We need to allow the market to impose stricter lending standards on its own. We need to allow the credit crunch to continue, because that is a good thing. We need to get credit away from consumers. We need to stop Americans from borrowing money to buy stuff so that credit can be freed up for producers to make stuff and provide employment opportunities. We need to allow the market to bring prices down, particularly real estate prices and stock prices. We have to allow inefficient and non-profitable companies to go bankrupt. And we have to allow people to lose money. We have to allow investors who made bad investments or creditors who made bad loans to lose their money.
So and you think that this will allow the economy to become again production or productive oriented?
Yes, this will allow the economy to restructure and rebalance so that it can be viable. Unfortunately, the process is going to involve a reduction in American standard of living. It's going to involve a fall in real wages. But this is all the consequence of years of reckless consumption. We squandered our wealth, we squandered our capital, and now we have to take quite a few steps back. We have to rebuild our savings, reindustrialize, rebuild our capital, and that's going to take time.
In one of your recent presentations, which I was reading yesterday, you call for a recession. You say that one way to get out of the current crisis to precisely allow the recession to take place.
Sure. I mean, it's not that I.
So tell us.
No, it's not that I want the recession.
It's going to be painful.
Well, any more than if somebody is sick and they have to swallow bitter tasting medicine. They don't necessarily want to swallow the medicine, but they want to get better, and the medicine is the way to do it. So if our economy is going to get healthy, we need to allow the recession to happen, because that's the medicine.
So what would be the characteristics of a recession compared to the situation in which we are now?
Well, in a recession, people have to be allowed to lose their jobs in those industries.
Right, it's happening now.
In those industries that are non-productive or non-viable. And we need to allow them those resources, that labor, to be reallocated to a more efficient use. Like when the NASDAQ bubble burst, one of the things that the government did right, is that they didn't try to bail out .coms. They didn't try to keep internet companies in business in order to maintain employment. That would have been a waste of resources. The reason that these internet companies went bankrupt was because they weren't viable. They weren't making profits. We didn't want people working in those companies. We wanted those companies out of business. And in a free market, if a company can't produce a profit, we want it out of business. We want businesses that are profitable, because profitable businesses mean an efficient allocation of resources, including labor. And so in order for workers to go from non-productive employment to productive employment, there is some transitory period of unemployment. We have to allow that to happen. If we just entrench them in the businesses that they're in, then society doesn't benefit from their labor. No, we don't want people to work just so they work. We want people working because they're productive. And people don't work because they enjoy labor. They work because of what they earn as a result of working.
So at the moment we have, I think in America, 7 million people more or less unemployed.
Well,
I mean, so
probably a lot more than that if you
yes.
count the people who are working part
Who are not
time,
drawing
who are
benefits
discouraged.
and so on, yes. So let's say 10 million perhaps. So, but you wouldn't qualify this as a recession, partly because we're not addressing the crisis in terms which would view them as, you know, welcoming, quote unquote, the recession.
Well, we're in a recession, and it's probably going to become a depression because of the government's attempts to solve the problem. They inadvertently make it worse.
Yes.
What they do is they interfere with the market forces trying to correct the economy. They make it more difficult for the market to rebalance the economy, and so they extend the process. We're ultimately going to have more unemployment as a result of what the government is doing, and those people who are employed are going to be less productive and have lower real incomes than would otherwise be the case.
So in your view, bailing out the banks was not a good idea. It was going against the forces of the market, the philosophy of the market.
Correct, and not only that, but you sow the seeds of future problems because the bailouts themselves create additional moral hazards. And now you have the U.S. government trying to regulate companies that they now deem too big to fail. Well, a better regulation would just be to let the market know that no company is too big to fail, and then the market will police these companies, because companies that are taking too much risk won't be able to borrow money. They won't be able to attract capital. Instead, we make them too big to fail, and now no matter how risky their activity, they'll always get funded.
But one would think that, I mean, you know, these banks is part of Wall Street and so on. One would think that the primary supporters of the market forces would have to be Wall Street, the banks. Why is it that it's not the case?
Well, that they don't, because they're the recipients of the bailouts. They're getting all this money, which they're using to lavish big salaries and big bonuses on themselves. So, you know, everybody wants government protection when it's their business that's being protected. The role of good government is to stay out. You know, is to not, you know, give in to that pressure. To treat everybody equally and to not subsidize one company or one group of people at the expense of others.
But I mean, you know, historically, culturally, these banks are presenting themselves as precisely the supporters of capitalism, of free market, and so on. So how can they be credible in this kind of line of discourse and at the same time?
Well, they're probably not. And you know, one of the inherent problems with
schizophrenia here.
One of the inherent problems with the banking system is the fact that we have insured deposits in the United States, and that is a huge moral hazard. One of the reasons that banks take the risks that they do is because depositors don't care. Because the government guarantees deposits, banks don't compete on safety. They only compete based on the interest that they pay. So we've built in an incentive to risk-taking that absent government-insured bank accounts would not exist. If people knew that by putting their money in the bank, there was a risk they wouldn't get it back, then the people would be more concerned about what banks did with their money. There would be more oversight. And so banks would actually have to advertise how safe they were. There would be independent agencies that were rating banks, and depositors would look at those, just like they, you know, when they want to buy a car, they go buy Consumer Reports and they read up about it. I mean, people do research before they buy a car, before they buy a cell phone or a plasma TV. Nobody does any research before they open a bank account. They just open one up.
Yeah, because we know that it's being guaranteed by the government.
Right, and of course the government guarantees we know are all worthless because the government is corrupt, and the government doesn't care because it's none of their own money. You know, and so the whole system it doesn't work because of the government. Now, you know, we have the government that is trying to solve the financial crisis that it created, and its solution is to create an even bigger problem.
So, but you know, so your point of view is that we should allow market forces to really run their course, and but you're also saying that for a number of years, in fact, we have an hybrid system in the context of which somehow market forces are not working.
In fact, and whenever I say that, the criticism is, well, no, that's what we tried before, and look at the mess that we're in. That's not what we tried before. It's not because we relied on free market forces that we're in this mess. It's because we relied on government intervention, on government subsidies, on central bank artificial manipulation of interest rates. It was because, or precisely because, we strayed away from free market principles that we're in this mess, and we need to re-embrace them as a solution.
So how do you re-embrace them? Because, you know, in one way or another, the government is going to be involved in this re-embrace. In one way or another, that's a fact of life in these days. So how do you? I mean, I don't know.
It wouldn't.
Probably it's a wrong assumption, but so how do you re-embrace this market
Well,
force?
it would be very easy to simply deregulate and to restore market forces and stop interfering. It's not very difficult. It's politically difficult because nobody wants to do it. And of course, the politicians are predisposed to blame the market and to say they have the solution, because that's how they get elected. They promise to solve problems, despite the fact that they're the principal problem creators. And in a way, the more problems they create, the more they justify their existence, and the easier it is for them to get reelected. And that's why we've got this dynamic now where the more the government interferes in the market, the more it creates a problem that now it can solve. And now its solution is more government, which makes the problem bigger, which now means they can solve it again.
So you would want things to change radically, but I mean, how do you think that these radical changes could happen? How are you going to be able to dissociate government forces and market forces, which are also...
We're going to have the political will and a political movement in this country to change the dynamic, to change the players, or to let the people making these laws know they're not going to get reelected if they keep legislating in this way. That if they are going to try to impose their own agenda above the market, if they're not going to abide by the Constitution, which they all swear an oath to uphold, we need to replace them with people who will, and people who actually understand what capitalism is all about, and understand that that is the source of our prior prosperity. It was precisely because we didn't have all this government regulation, we didn't have all these moral hazards, we didn't have all this spending, that we became so wealthy in the first place. And the source of our current predicament is because we strayed from those principles, because we grew our government and at the expense of the private sector.
What would be your definition of capitalism? Capitalism understood as faithful to the forces of free market.
Well, capitalism is where resources are allocated by the market, not by the government, and where decisions are made by private individuals who are seeking profits, not by politicians who are seeking votes. We allow supply and demand to set price, not government fiat, and I think that particularly has to apply to money. We need to let interest rates be determined by market forces, not by the whim of central bankers.
And what is the nature of risk in this capitalist world that you're talking about? I mean, because at the moment it's more like you are privatizing gains and socializing losses.
Well, of course, capitalism doesn't work if you do that. You have to, what keeps people from taking unnecessary risks is the consequences if the risks go bad. But if the government tries to remove those consequences, guard against them, subsidize them, guarantee them, then you have an incentive to take additional risk. If we allow market forces to work, there won't be excessive risk taking, because there'll be a cost. Right. But the government wants to remove the cost. We don't want to eliminate all risk taking. I mean, we want reasonable risk taking, and and we want the people who are making the bets to know that they're betting their own money, and to realize that if they bet wrong, they lose, so that they will weigh the risks appropriately.
But is the government really removing the cost? Because in fact, when it comes to the bailout, a lot of people are saying, well, in fact, it's about transforming private debts into public debts.
But we shouldn't be doing that.
No,
I mean, first of all,
so it's not removing the cost. It's reallocating the cost.
And first of all, it's morally wrong. I mean, why should people who weren't even a party to these transactions be made to suffer for the losses? They didn't lend the money. Why should they have to suffer when the debts go bad? We have to allow the people who made bad decisions to suffer the consequences of those decisions, not push them off on other people. And the moral hazard that sends, or the precedent for the future, that encourages more of that type of activity. If you know that, well, I can take this big risk because if it works out, I get the benefit, and if it doesn't work, the taxpayer is going to have to take my losses. You can't have a system like that.
In previous presentations that you gave around the country, you talk about the geopolitics of the public debt. I mean, what are going to be the consequences of this huge public debt that the US now has?
Well, the consequences are that we're going to repudiate it. I mean, we're going to default on it one way or the other. Because it's just so enormous, we can't pay it back. I think, which is one of the reasons that it's going to keep increasing, because I think we've already know that. We borrowed so much money, we might as well keep on borrowing. And I think the world is in a very difficult predicament because there's no easy way out. Because if they stop loaning us money, then we default on what we've already borrowed. But if they keep loaning us money, then they end up losing even more.
Yes.
Because the more money they lend us, the less likely we are to pay it back. And when I talk about default, I mean default can have two forms. It can have an honest form, where the U.S. government is honest with its creditors and says, look, we can't pay, and we need to restructure the debt. Or a dishonest default, where we pay, but we do it by printing money instead of cutting spending or raising taxes. But when we pay our debts by printing money, it's the same thing as not paying them at all, because the dollars that everybody gets won't buy very much. So you lose your purchasing power just as if we had defaulted.
And in this context, you are foreseeing a currency crisis affecting first and foremost the dollar, and you also, when it comes to the geopolitics of the public debt, you are talking about the fact that, for instance, China is not going to get its money back.
Absolutely, this currency will end. This crisis will end up as a currency crisis. Right now, the consequences are being held at bay by government bailouts and government stimulus. But ultimately, it's the U.S. government itself that's going to need a bailout, because the government's going to fail, because we are funding all the stimulus with borrowed money. We're forcing the Chinese and the Japanese and the rest of the world to pay for these misguided stimulus plans, which are not actually stimulating the economy, but exacerbating the problems, making the situation worse, that require even more bailouts and stimulus. And ultimately, when the world, stops, and decides it's had enough of this, then the only way of funding it will be from a printing press. And it seems that that's the route that we're going.
Yeah, because you seem to think that at one point, China, Japan, and so on will say, well, enough is enough. So when this day, which will be a day of reckoning in a way, will happen, so what happens when China and Japan...
Well, now we're going to have, America's going to have a tough choice, because interest rates are going to skyrocket, prices are going to skyrocket in this country, and we're going to have to decide if we want to completely destroy our currency, or cut government spending and reduce the size of government, and allow businesses to fail without bailing them out, allow people to lose money without bailing them out, because we won't really have any way of bailing them out other than printing money, but that will destroy the dollar. And people that say, well, that'll never happen, those are the same people that said internet stocks would never fall, or the same people that said real estate prices will never fall, or they assume that just because something's been happening for a while, it will happen forever.
Yes.
But it's not. Just because the world has been foolish enough to lend us a lot of money that we can't pay back doesn't mean they're going to make those mistakes indefinitely.
And this doomsday scenario, when do you see it possibly happening?
Well, there's no way to know the exact timing. And it's not necessarily a doomsday scenario, it is the scenario.
Yes.
There is no way out of this without a major collapse in the United States.
So it's going to happen?
Yes. Okay. The question is, does it happen in 6 months? Does it happen in a year? Does it happen in 2 years? The one thing I know for sure is the further into the future it happens, the worse it's going to be. Because the longer we keep going, the more debt we're allowed to accumulate, the more our economy is allowed to move away from production towards consumption, right? The more of our industry shuts down, the more manufacturers go under, the more out of balance our economy becomes, the bigger the problem comes, and the more severe the consequences to solve it.
And so you are saying that the political establishment cannot afford politically to confront this fact which is upon us.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with politicians is they have a very short time horizon. They can only see to the next election. And so in their opinion, solving the problem means keeping everything going so I can get elected one more time. But in doing that, all they're simply doing is postponing and exacerbating the problem. But they don't seem to care, because their only concern is their own re-election. Their concern is not for the well-being of the country that they're governing, but their own political ambition and careers.
And so what for the long run? I mean, what does it mean for the place and the importance of America as a superpower worldwide, just turning to the role of the U.S.
Well, we're not going to be a superpower in the future if we continue on this path. We're not going to be able to afford it. I mean, right now we're paying for a lot of our military might by borrowing money, and ultimately, if we destroy the economy, domestically, we're not going to have any power internationally. We'll be no more of a superpower than Argentina is.
Yeah. And you truly think that at one point the countries which are owning the American debt will really change their way, and they would say enough is enough.
Well, sure. I mean, when you lend somebody money, the idea is to get paid back. It's not, you're not giving a gift. And ultimately, that's what the world is doing. They're lending us money, and we're spending it.
Yes.
So because we're not investing it, it basically means we can't pay it back. We're not acquiring a capital from which we can repay these debts. We're simply borrowing to consume, and the more we borrow today, the more we have to borrow in the future. The world will eventually get out of this Ponzi scheme. And
you call it a Ponzi scheme.
Well, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And they'll stop participating, and instead of lending their money to us, they will keep their savings for themselves and invest it locally in more productive means than letting us squander it. And ultimately what will happen is the dollar will lose a lot of value, other currencies will rise in value, our purchasing power will be transferred abroad, and all the production is still going to take place. The main change is going to be, it's not going to be Americans who are going to enjoy the consumption, it will be people in other countries.
Okay. Any additional point that you would want to really have people keeping in mind as we are reaching the end of our conversation? No, any?
I mean, maybe as the audience is the UN, is for the United Nations as a policy, to understand these longer-term dynamics and to not encourage nations around the world to continue, buying U.S. government debt, lending money to the United States government, buying our mortgage-backed securities, because all they are doing is encouraging a worsening of the global economic imbalances. The best thing that can happen for the world and America is for the world to cut us off. Because the more money we borrow, the bigger our government gets, which means the less productive our economy becomes, and the more money is squandered on consumption. If the world really wants to lend money in America and invest in America, let them do it through private business. Don't buy government bonds. Lend money to entrepreneurs, invest in businesses, help us build factories so that we can produce things and be competitive and repay our debts. But unfortunately, we're not going to attract that kind of capital until we really reform our regulatory systems and our tax systems so that capital can be more competitive in the United States.
So that's very interesting, Mr. Schiff. Really, I thank you for your time. Mr. Schiff is currently the president of Eurocapital Incorporated, and we had a conversation on the prediction of the crisis and how it is likely to unfold in the future. I thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.